remember one man, and he was going down William Street, and somebody called him, and he says, I can't stop now. I must go down. I'll be down at the Guildhall. You see, there's a riot at 3:30. And I thought to myself, how can you time a riot? But there's a riot at 3:30 and I have to be there. Then there's a photograph of him taken in a book where he has a round biscuit tin on his head, and that's his helmet.
In the early 50s, there were still parts of Northern Ireland where life hadn't changed much since the turn of the century. Small, isolated communities neglected by the march of progress. Places like Derry Kerrib, right on the border, in Fermanagh Lakeland.
The water was the road then. There was no other way of getting to or fro any town, and Belturbet, County Cavan, would have been the main town for the people here, because you just only crossed over this narrow neck and you're into Lanesborough Estate, County Cavan, and there was a road up there which brought you straight into Belturbet, no laneway. They brought the pigs to Belturbet Fair, and they brought the eggs, they brought the cattle, smuggled them, jumped or swam them or caught them, whichever. The cot was something similar to a boat, only she was flat in the bottom with two raised ends. And they caught it in hay, they caught it in horses and carts. They even brought in mow machines on the top of them. There was no way in, you see, until 1939. And they canvassed and looked around and they got a few pounds, and they got the bridge finished about 1941. You had a bridge and no road. It was very isolated, like. But everybody was happy because everybody was the one way. Our house that we're sitting in now was thatched until 1979, and thatching was a problem too, because you had to either grow wheat or rye to do the thatching. My father was a great thatcher, all right, but he was often like the cobbler's wife. The cobbler's wife was often barefooted. Our house was often an odd hole in the roof. There was no running water on this island. You went to the lough for the water, or you went to a neighbour that had a spring well for the water to make tea. But Daddy, you would have made no money on the farm. Like, it was just a matter of the fellas said cooling and supping, just ticking over. The hens kept the whole show going, and that was my mother's role, looking after the hens. And Sunday, my mother would sit down in the middle of the floor with maybe 40 dozen and clean eggs. And then the eggs were brought up in buckets and baskets and anywhere they could be got to where the main road is. And O'Donnell was the traveller, and he took the eggs, and then the groceries was got, and the dealing was done then. And the balance was, you maybe had £2 back or £1 back or £2.50 or whatever.
Change came slowly to Derry Kerrib. But elsewhere, it was coming fast, swept along by a dependable supply of cheap electricity. It had been available in the centre of Belfast since the turn of the century to power the trams and light some of the bigger businesses. An all-electric house went on show at Balmoral in the late 20s. By the 50s, streets were being ripped up to provide domestic supplies. And cables were laid under the harbour to carry electric power out to the country. It wasn't long before it reached the farmland of East Antrim.
We got electricity about the beginning of 1956. It had gone down through in wires to the local village about 1953, but farmers certainly didn't take it in so fast for the simple reason that usually to a farmhouse they had to put what they called a transformer up to reduce the volts from the main power line into a separate farm. And there are farmers to this day paying heavy standing charges on their electricity bill over the head of these transformers that had to be put in. The installation of electricity opened up the farms. The very fact that you could drive any machinery through an electric motor certainly made a big difference. The milking machines were attached then to the electricity. Stationary engines became defunct, and they then were scrapped. You had electricity where you wanted it.
Cheap domestic labour had become scarce during the war, when women went to work in munitions factories and other better paid jobs. It was still hard to find in the early 50s, but here again, electricity would provide the solution.
If you'd have told me 20 years ago that all these new contrivances would have come along and done away with my old kitchen range, I'd have told you to go about your business lickety-split.
The appliance of science came to the rescue of a growing middle class. High street stores opened up, stacked with the latest labour-saving gadgets to tempt the housewife. The advertising was seductive.
Someday, some way, I'm going to have a service, fully automatic. I just drop in the clothes, switch on, and that's that.
Women were encouraged to think of housework as a vocation. There were classes to demonstrate the latest inventions.
Vacuum cleaners certainly were one of the greatest things ever come into a woman's life, because she either used what we referred to in those days as a big bism. Do you ever see a big bism of a brush to brush the carpet?
Chopped up cabbage leaves or wet tea leaves were sprinkled over the carpet once a week and then swept off it with a hard, long-handled brush. That's how the carpets were done. And then, of course, at spring cleaning, they were all lifted and thrown out on the lawn and beaten with sticks. When I was young, the washing was done out in the yard on a great big wooden tub by the washerwoman. The water was boiled on the large range.
I used to watch my mother and Mrs. Beale with the tub outside and the washboard scrubbing away at football tugs and things like that. Now you open the door and throw them into the washing machine and that's it.
A television set in the early 50s cost about £60. There was only one channel, the BBC, and black and white, of course. Northern Ireland's first television transmitter went up at Glencairn in 1953. The end of civilised conversation and the arrival of the couch potato, according to some.
I can remember going over the border to Lifford to watch the wedding of the Queen on television.
My first memory of television, oh yes, there was a fight going on one night between big fighters. Would it have been Ali, what do you call him? You know that fighter that's kind of drowsy now?
Liston's face is bleeding and he can't stop the punches coming into him.
And it was very snowy, you could see nothing. But then it got better after that.
I'm the king of the world. Hold it. Hold it, you're not that crazy. I'm a bad man. I shook up the world.
Don't you know that artist, he's awfully good. He has the little wobbling stick. What's this you call him? He's a great comedian. Come on, you know him. He sang. And the Duty Man or the Doddy Man.
One of the BBC's first local programmes was to feature Ernie Scott.
This program's about them and the way they live on their family farm.
There's my house and buildings, and now you can see the fields.
Because I neighboured with this farmer, I happened to be drawn into it too.
There's one thing hasn't changed, and that's my neighbour. Ernie Scott's father worked with my father, and I worked with him, and he helps me.
The culmination of the film was my wedding, and they decided to film it, and it was quite a daunting experience.
At the business end, farming was being transformed.
Farming from about the 50s on became really a business which had to be looked after. The hen cages started to come in, and what they called the deep litter in those days also came in. Well, that did away with the housewife getting her pin money from the sale of the poultry and the eggs. The cows are even fed by computer in conjunction with their milk yield. No farmer would ever have thought about that up until the 50s. They forked the meal into them, and they were maybe getting a gallon of milk out of them, but they still got the same meal. The look of the countryside has changed completely since I was a boy. Where a man could have worked all winter clearing a hedge out to make a bigger field, this can be done now in a couple of 3 hours with a JCB and carted away. The birds have gone. You very, very seldom see a big flock of peewits now, or plover. You don't see or hear the curlew any longer, because there's no wetland. The wetland has been done away with. You used to be able to go out at night and hear what we, the Ulster Scots, call the heller bleat. Now that was the snipe. I haven't seen a snipe for years.
Free healthcare was probably the most far-reaching reform this century. Before 1948, being ill was expensive. All treatment had to be paid for. But in towns like Omagh, cash was in short supply.
I can remember patients coming to the surgery with live chickens, literally in a bag with their legs tied, eggs, duck eggs, goose eggs, turkey eggs, and that sort of thing. I mean, and that was sometimes the way they did pay the doctor. And I mean, a lot of the country doctors accepted that was the way they're going to be paid, and they didn't. They were quite happy with that.
If you had to go into hospital, the costs really mounted.
They paid the consultant, they paid the hospital, and they paid for their stay. If they couldn't pay, they were allowed to pay in installments. I mean, I know people that have told me that they had to pay by installments to have when they had their appendix removed in the Tyrone County Hospital prior to 1948.
Then along came the National Health Service.
You could treat every patient exactly as you wanted to. You never had to think of finance, that particular patient had to pay you money for a service. You were able to refer them to the best consultants in the country. You could send them to hospital without them having to pay a fee. You could give them the most expensive drugs available if they needed them. You didn't have to think twice before you wrote a prescription.
Haldane Mitchell studied medicine at Queen's University in the early 50s. He then followed his father into the family practice. He was an early beneficiary of another landmark reform, free education.
I had a scholarship to Queen's, although there were still students there on the pay basis. And of course, they enjoyed themselves and they were not in any hurry to qualify. And there were still a few ex-servicemen about. There were about 3,000 students, only a fraction of what there is today. And the whole attitude was very much more laid back, and there was plenty of time for pleasure and there was plenty of time to work.
After the misery of the war years, Northern Ireland was taking on a more affluent, carefree look, at least for some.
Magic moments, memories we've been sharing. Magic moments when two hearts are caring. Time can't erase the memory of these magic moments filled with love.
The improvements in the education system created other demands too.
There was no library in Strabane for many years. And then branch libraries were started in the various towns, and I was asked if I would undertake the running of the branch in Strabane. I needed the money at the time after my husband died, and so I did that for 20 years. The library in those days was greatly needed because, of course, more and more people were getting higher education. And we had a rule in the library that each person could only take out one novel, but they could take out 2 non-fiction, so that there was an accent on reading more intellectual stuff. I began, I think, with about 1,000 books, and when I left, there were many thousand books to be dealt with.
John Henning went to night class to improve on an education that had ended at 10 years of age. But his day job was with Belfast Corporation.
I started in the cleansing department at the very bottom rung. That's putting the bins on the lorries. You went up the door, bin man, you're up the door and shout, bin man. And come on in. And tell me who's you went in there. Honestly, you had to walk through where they were lying in the kitchen. You're talking about big families named. They were lying in the kitchen, and you had to walk out, and you had to walk out the open yard. And then you got the bin, and the two of you carried that in again. And the yard with all the traces of somebody up through the night. You know what I'm talking about? And then the lorry came up, and the bin man, he'd them in. Oh, it was dirty. Dirty. We had to go in at night and go home and get into the yard and strip there. When you're bringing flesh home the side of your finger. Terrible job. But it was a constant job. And that's why I went for it, because once you get in the corporation, you are there for life unless you misbehaved yourself or something. And not only that, you had a free pension at the end of it. So I was looking away in front. So I got 36 years out of it.
The poor housing and overcrowding John Henning saw on his bin round were commonplace in the 50s. Northern Ireland had some of the worst housing in Europe. In Belfast, nearly a quarter of the dwellings were lacking basic amenities. In Londonderry, the waiting time to get rehoused from the slums of the Bogside was up to 5 years. Maid Kelly's job with the Housing Trust brought her in daily contact with these statistics.
Bad housing in Protestant and Catholic areas, to me, they were unequal. I mean, the Fountain here in Derry was, to me, just as bad as the Bogside. I mean, I saw it. People don't believe. They say the Protestants, they always had good housing. They did not. Their housing was equally poor.
Haldane Mitchell, fresh out of Queen's, saw the worst of conditions during his doctor's rounds in Omagh.
There were parts of the town where running water didn't exist. Certainly sewage as such was purely dry toilets in the backyard, and there was an area of the town where in fact you simply had a common tap on the street where everybody went and got their water. They'd have absolutely no plumbing at all.
Omagh had a special architectural claim to fame, its hanging loos.
These were the toilets, which were made of corrugated iron and were suspended from the row of houses. There were 10 of them, and they simply flushed directly into the river. All Omagh's sewerage went into the river up into the mid-60s. The town flooded regularly, every 10 years or so, and in the area that I lived in, it wasn't unusual to have 3 foot of water in your kitchen. When it flooded, all the sewers went into reverse, and you got an awful lot of excreta into the houses. Some of the houses became a terrible mess.
In those days, they had to move into the granny's house, their mother's house, and you maybe had old grandfather there and a couple of old bachelor brothers, and then you would come in, and in next to no time you'd a whole clatter of children, and the whole thing got more and more overcrowded and more on people's nerves.
I can remember very well driving into these little back alleys with my father and going into the houses and excusing yourself downstairs and having to walk upstairs to the family upstairs that you're going to see, and there they were. And often there was no rooms. It was just a large open area with maybe 3 double beds to cater for the family, and then even upstairs again for another family on the top floor.
Even when better accommodation was found, it didn't necessarily solve the problems.
Went along to see a woman, and she was living in her mother's house, and there was one bed in the room, and there was a new baby coming, and there was 4 children in the room, and her husband, and one bed. And I thought, this is terrible, something will have to be done very soon. Anyway, we allocated her a lovely 3-bedroomed house. I was passing one day, and I thought, better go in and see how this lady's getting on. You see, I haven't seen her for a couple of months now, so I went in, and she was pleased to see me. I was of her. And she said, do you want to see round the house? I said, I'd be very delighted to see round the house. How's everybody getting on? Oh, grand, grand, she says. So we went upstairs to the first bedroom, empty. Not even a pair of curtains on the window. Into the next bedroom, empty. And I thought, am I in the right house? Into the 3rd bedroom, where the same bed, the same number of family except one more child, and her husband, still sleeping in the same bed, all together in the one room. And I looked at her and said, these boys and girls should be separated, boys in here. Oh, she says, sure, they would be lonely.
If you had half a dozen kids sleeping in a bed, and as a boy beside a girl and a girl beside a boy, you can see how easy it is for one to abuse the other. And of course this is, we talked today about child abuse. There was far more child abuse 30, 40, 50 years ago than there is today, and it was purely because of the limited housing and as a result of overcrowding literally in bed at night.
Large families were partly an investment of hope in the future, but they were also due to a lack of effective birth control.
Most people used the period as a guide, that the week before and the week after was safe, and the rest of the time was taking a chance, and that's simply how it was done. The rhythm method only came into being really as a teaching of the Catholic Church in the last 50 years.
It wasn't very permissive at that time. Like, there was the odd person, but not to the degree it is now.
The condom was again really brought to this country more or less by the Americans during the war, and it's only been used since the war.
Only saw them once at that stage.
Where?
One night a fella showed them the chip shop. Don't put that.
And here's a mixture for making what has come to be known throughout the world simply as the pill. Millions of words have been written for and against it. For this little white tablet is more explosive than dynamite.
When the contraceptive pill became available, it took time to gain acceptance in conservative communities like Northern Ireland.
You could tell when lassies would come into the surgery and talk sort of round a subject, you suddenly begun to realise that there wasn't an awful lot wrong with them, and really what they wanted was to ask you about the pill. And if you were quick enough to realise that that's what they wanted, you simply just put it to them straight away. Is it the pill you really want?
Sermons have been preached on it. Men and women have argued over it. It's the most controversial pill ever produced.
The pill posed particular dilemmas for Roman Catholic doctors and their patients. But at Haldane Mitchell's surgery in Omagh, there was a straightforward solution.
I was frequently asked by my Catholic colleagues, would I prescribe the pill for their patients, which I did quite happily.
Back in East Antrim, Ernie Scott had become increasingly disillusioned with farm life. More sophisticated machinery was required to do the work efficiently. That meant more investment and smaller profits. And Ernie had another problem.
I had 4 girls and no sons, and I was the last of the Scots of my generation. None of the girls were interested in farming. Of course, they weren't when they were young anyway. But with having 42 acres, it was really not enough to start to make all the changes that should have been made on a bigger farm. And with the result that not having had a holiday from I was married, we decided that we'd give up the farming and go into something else. With the result that I sold the 42 acres and never looked back since, never regretted it.
Ernie and his family settled in Ballinure, and he got a job selling dairy cleaning equipment across Northern Ireland. Round about the time Ernie Scott was selling up, John James Donoghue was leaving school at 14 to take over from his father at Derry Kerrib.
He was in bad health with the heart, so I carried it on, and I was considering going to America because me and him couldn't get on that well. And then he died in '59. He didn't want me out late every night, and I had a habit of doing that. But I was always there the next morning to do the work. There was nothing went to loss over me running about.
What were you out doing?
Dancing.
I got no kick, you're getting small and jack. Unless they try to play it too damn fast. I rule the beauty of the melody.
Dancing was as popular as ever, but a daring new style had sparked off another kind of revolution. The unique local variation of rock and roll was proclaimed by the show bands.
Any old time to use it. It's gotta be rock and roll music. If you wanna dance.
We danced everywhere. You went out to the end of our road and you met maybe 25 between boys and girls, and we headed off to Belturbet or Clonus or Cavan.
Way up in the north, an old tire owners.
At one time, nearly every village in Ireland seemed to have its own show band. But the unofficial capital of the music scene was Omagh.
Omagh's connection with the show band scene is quite simple. It was the St. Eugene's Brass and Reed Band. It's been going continuously for over 125 years in this town. And the young Catholic boys, and today Protestant boys that play in that band, they would have learned their clarinet, their saxophone in that band, and that's what have started them off in the band era.
She wears my ring and tells her friend she's gonna marry.
At one stage, this town had actually about 10 bands in and around the town. Brian Call had his own band. He was in the Plattermen initially, and then he had the Buckaroos. And of course, very few people don't know Artie Midlin. Artie started with the Plattermen. Derek Mahaffey, he's still playing. And of course, there was Frankie McBride and the Polka Dots.
I dreamt that I was back again in dear old days.
The Mighty Evans, Larry Cunningham and them came on the scene, and he was the Jim Reeves style singer. Larry made a couple of records, like he made one on Lovely Leitrim.
It was my lovely Leitrim wife.
Oh, they were a mighty band because they filled the halls till you couldn't put your hand in your pocket. There was that big a crowd.
Packed to the doors. So that if you weren't there before 9 o'clock, you simply didn't get in.
Ireland swings like nowhere else can.
It was the one fashion for everybody nearly. It was a suit of clothes and a short and tie and a jumper. And you went into the hall and you danced the whole night and you never took anything off. Sweat lashing everywhere, past our mouth.
There was no such thing as booze or anything. You got a mineral or a cup of tea or something.
You never saw a woman with drinking on.
Go dancing.
Or you weren't going to look for a fella. That wasn't the prime thing in your mind. Mind you, if a presentable one presented himself, you know, and the humour was on you.
Don't forget, Brandon, bring your Hucklebuck shoe. Strangers in the night, exchanging glances.
And that's where the most of the wives was found, was at the dances, like. There was no place else like going to the pub to meet them. No, you wouldn't meet them in the pub at the time. No, we weren't going to pubs. So the dance hall was the place for meeting the landlady, eventually.
Something in your eyes.
I met the wife at a dance in Belturbet in the town hall. That was the first time I ever saw her, and she was at plenty of dances.
Something in my heart.
We were 4 years going together before we got married, and there was a year of turbulency. So that's how it happened.
Not everyone was so enthusiastic about showband mania. For May King, who owned ballrooms in Belfast and Dublin, it was the beginning of the end for her kind of dancing and her business.
Everybody wanted to hear the show band, and of course the price went up. And some show bands, if I wanted to pay them, there'd be no profit. They wanted half the takings in one of the ballrooms. That was cut out. And then they always wanted a hot meal in a hotel. What hotel would they go to? You see, they got above themselves because they were so powerful. Everybody wanted to hear them, you know.
Try to see it my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go on? While you see it your way.
There's no dancing now, there's only the waving of the hand. It's a concert, and they watch four boys. There's no variety, there's no change. They're all doing the one thing. The perspiration's pouring off them. They look very, very tired. They look as if they're not enjoying it, and they're all waving their arms. It's a complete change of attitude.
Despite the arrival of pop culture, many in Northern Ireland marched on to the traditional beat. For 70 years, Donald Sloan has been keeping time to it, and at 91, he's showing no sign of trailing behind.
I get into a position where I'm not too prominent, you see. I'd probably go to the row before the back. And then if you fall back, you get a thump on the back, you see, with a flute or something. I'm not in the orange order or the black or any other order. The only thing I'm in is a band.
Run! A chance! John! Work time!
That's got nothing to do politically. It's musically. The band take an engagement in anything. That's how they exist financially. It's not just orange and black marches. They do other things as well.
Donald marched through a golden age, he says, when orange parades didn't generate the ill feeling that exists around them today.
My first wealth was from the Ballyrobert Orange Hall to the Clondyboy Crossroads. Oh, I thought I was a great fella that day. I'd be about 13. I thought it was great being able to play in a band on parade. It was like a day out for people.
Oh, the 12th was brilliant. Brilliant. Every street, Shankill Road and all the weed stage streets had their arches, and every house had a Union Jack out. You felt good about it, you know. Sort of a triumphal thing. Used to walk along with my dad and carry the string to the banner, you know, for the boy. And he got a couple of bob for doing it the 12th day. And then as I came to age, I went into the Orange Order myself. And I'm now 70 years on it. And I got the top on it. And at one time, I was a chief marshal. And that was my job to get them marshalled. And in the districts, walk the field, and then have their speeches there, and their lunch, and then reassemble again for making the journey home.
For many years, Donald Sloan was a member of the Shankill Road-based Ulster Amateurs, one of Belfast's top flute bands.
The band went with the Ballinafy district for about 20 years, both on the 12th and on the last Saturday in August. We marched from Ballinaffy down to the bottom of Ormer Avenue and fell in at the City Hall.
And no trouble on the Ormer Road in those days?
Absolutely none. And many a time coming back, people would have come out with a drink or a cup of tea or something.
It was a day out, big excursion, and you always watched them. And sometimes I remember some friends going down to see them coming back from the field where they go. Oh yeah, it was different then. You knew they were Protestants, but there was no feeling like that.
My sister lived in Fruit Hill Park, which is in Andersonstown. And of course the field was quite close to where they were. And I was able to walk up to Fruit Hill Park in my band uniform and carrying her flute. And went up there and got the shoes off and got a cup of tea and a rest for an hour and a half and walked back down again. Nobody ever said to me, "What are you doing up here?"
I was a dairy with a planted boys, the boat sailors. You say, let their chimneys all get dirtied. No, not their suit in them.
And they marched on the walls, you see, with their regalia and their aprons, and the people in Nailers Row used to set a light to their fires.
And that belched out smoke. I'd come all up round their planted boys and their bonners and their sacks.
Spoiled everything for them. But this was a deliberate joke. They did every year, and when the Orange men had stopped marching, they all came down and had tea and buns and booze and everything else. It was entirely different, you know. I don't know where it has all gone wrong.
I was as well known on the Falls Road as I was in the Shankill, through greyhound racing and my running. I was an orange man, and the people on Salt Lake Park knew me. I was an orange, and used to call me the wee green orange man. But nobody ever threatened me.
Would you have Catholic friends?
Yes, and I'm out the Catholic friend. Want the Catholic houses. Certainly. Certainly.
In Fermanagh, communities mostly lived in harmony too, but memories of the marching season are not so rose-tinted.
The relations between Protestant and Catholics in the 50s and 60s was first class, like until the 12th of July had come and the sports day had come. And the sports day was a big event, and Canon Maguire's Feast it was known as, and there'd be thousands at it. And my teacher, Mrs. McGahey, had 4 wee lassies doing Munster, Leinster, Ulster and Connaught, and the police put them off the street just because it looked too Irish. Well, before that, a man was carrying the tricolour and the police moved in to take it, and then a bit of a scuffle broke out. So then, that was in 55, I think. Well, then 56 it was on again, and the parade went down the town, and the police came with water cannons and sprayed the cannon to him and drowned him, blew the hat off him with water cannons.
With the ballrooms hitting lean times, May King had bought a large house in South Belfast and begun alterations to turn it into a hotel, the Drumkeen. But as work got underway, her husband Eddie developed a serious illness.
And on the night of opening Drumkeen, I had a lot of friends I had invited, and I was dressed to kill, the earrings and the lot. Eddie was in the cancer hospital, and I was on my own. It was a very, very severe operation. It really went on for about 3 years, and he was on liquid food. We sold the hotel and went down to live in Dublin. And Eddie lived 16 years.
Make sure you know cancer's 7 danger signals. Any sore that does not heal, a lump or thickening in the breast or elsewhere, unusual bleeding or discharge.
My wife Agnes was getting dressed one morning for church, and she discovered a lump. And she called my daughter, who was a nurse, and she had a look at her and she says, there'll be no church for you this morning. So instead of going to church, we went to the Royal. And she was operated on the following Monday morning and had a breast removed. And that was the start of it. there was secondary cancer as well. So she eventually died in October 1968, and that was almost about 5 years after the time.
15 years later, Eilish, who had nursed her mother, also succumbed to cancer, and so too would Donald's youngest son, Brendan, in 1994.
He was only ill about a week. He won the captain's prize in Dunmurray the week before it. And he was feeling tired, which was very unusual for him. And they took him into the city. He was only there a week when he died.
By the late 60s, inroads were being made on Northern Ireland's terrible housing conditions. Entire estates were being built. But despite the improvements, allocation of housing now emerged as a major grievance of the Catholic population. Attention focused on the Tyrone village of Caledon, when a Catholic mother was forcibly removed after squatting in a house allocated to a single Protestant girl. A young nationalist MP, Austin Curry, joined the protest. Housing, electoral injustice, and discrimination in jobs created a potent mixture of resentment and frustration that found voice in the civil rights movement.
Well, I wasn't too interested in politics at the very start, but seeing the way that the gerrymandering was going around this area in the 68, 69, when the neighbours in the cottage houses was going to be moved down to Dona to let Protestants into their houses to split the vote. And that's how I got really involved. And then we started protesting with the civil rights. Austin Curry came up to Newton Butler. Frank McManus was a school teacher at that time. He was the MP later on. Paddy Kennedy, John Hume, they all come to Newton Butler and called meetings, and we went in and we got sucked in that way.
I was actually going to the Oma General Hospital to a delivery, and when I was driving down the road, on the left-hand side there was a group of nationalists gathering, and the police and the B specials were actually getting ready with headgear and protection gear. That was my first experience in Oma in 1969 of a civil rights march.
Absolutely, the troubles were inevitable. Anybody with a tit of a brain about them. People had come to breaking point. They had no dignity left anymore. So something had to give.
And it's almost Independence Day.
The Roman Catholics said that they were treated as second-class citizens, but I knew Roman Catholics better off than I was, because it was the same thing. There was unemployment everywhere. So the Protestants were as badly off as the Roman Catholics were, you know. So like, I wouldn't have said that it was all Protestant. Maybe I'm biased, I don't know.
I think the civil rights people had a case, because if you looked at places like Londonderry, there was a great imbalance at one time. You know, the boundaries and everything else were adjusted to suit the unionist cause, and I think they had a case. But then, as all things like that, it got out of hand.
You must leave now, take what you need, you think will last. But whatever you wish to keep, you better grab it fast. Yonder stands your orphan with his gun.
With Northern Ireland descending into chaos, many unionists, including Ernie Scott, joined the B Specials.
I am proud to be associated with these men who give up their leisure time to protect the state and protect lives and property.
It was over the head of late '69 when the trouble started in Londonderry. We all thought, and as well as that in Belfast, we thought that they probably would spread. And that, well, out of a patriotic sort of a thing, we have tried to do something.
Ernie was under no illusion about the depth of the problem his government now faced.
Well, they're bound to have had a case for civil rights whenever everybody had no vote. As far as I remember, it was only the ratepayers had a vote. And if you had 6 properties, you had 6 votes, which was an entirely an erroneous thing. Everybody should have had a vote.
The B Specials were now patrolling the grounds of Stormont. John James Donoghue, meanwhile, was preparing to join a picket there.
The first time I ever went to Belfast was in a motorcade to Stormont from Newton Butler. And we went down to protest at the way things was going, like. And we were escorted by the police in Newton Butler down as far as maybe Maguire's Bridge or farther. And then another group took us on and brought us down to certain bridges across the M1, and then another crowd brought us on and escorted us the whole way to Belfast with no problems. And there was reporters from Germany, France, all over the world there, and with the sympathy of the world at that stage. And that was my first run to Belfast.
While striking all the match, yeah, folks starting you, folks starting you. It's all over now, baby blue. Yeah, it's all over
In part 4 of The Lives of Our Time, living with violence, everyone is touched by tragedy. But there's room for romance too. John Henning gets a medal, finally. And May King passes judgment on the 90s.